Welcome back. We've reached the point in the narrative where the Persian Empire is in control. The Persians have defeated the Babylonian Empire, and everything that was part of the Babylonian Empire is now part of the Persian Empire. And King Cyrus, the leader of the Persian Empire, he takes a very different approach to his leadership. He, instead of torturing people and frightening people into submission, he allows the people to return to their homelands, and he even pays to rebuild their cities, knowing that it'll generate tax revenue that will benefit the Persian Empire. And so he gains favor with the people, and it's a very great plan. Things go very well for them. And for the Jews, they go back to their land. Only about 10% of them, though, return to Judah. The rest just stay in Babylon. They were comfortable. Many of them had been there many of them were born there, in fact. And they don't really have the connection that the older people would have with Jerusalem. And they have thriving businesses, they have families, they have friends. Why leave all that and go to a city that's lying in rubble? Just so that you can do all the hard work of rebuilding, living. You don't have a house anymore. You have nothing to go back to. So a lot of them stayed in Babylon, and the families, kind of moved around a little bit. Some of them were, later on in history, were forced to move other places. But the 10% that returned to Judah, their priority was serving the Lord. When they were living in Babylon, knowing that Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed, they couldn't offer their sacrifices. They couldn't obey that part of the Torah. But they did have the rest of the Torah. They would get together regularly and study the Torah and help each other to understand how to serve God faithfully so that this catastrophe would never happen again. And that'll become important later on, right? But now these people return, and one of their first priorities is to rebuild the temple of the Lord so they can start offering the proper sacrifices. Zerubbabel is a man who he became the governor in Jerusalem, and he's leading this whole thing. And they clear out the debris where the temple stood, and they finally lay the foundation of the temple, and they had a big celebration. And the book of Ezra describes this, saying, "They sang, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, saying, 'For he is good, for his loving kindness is upon Israel forever.' And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the Lord was laid. Yet many of the priests, the Levites, and the heads of the fathers' households, the old men who had seen the first temple," right, they were children when they were first deported, but they were old enough to remember Jerusalem, and now they're going back to it, and they're remembering the glory of Solomon's temple and looking at the foundation and realizing this is going to be nothing like the original. This is so small and insignificant compared to what I remember. So many of these old men who had seen the first temple wept with a loud voice when the foundation of the house was laid before their eyes. Many others shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not distinguish between the sound of the shout of joy from the sound of weeping of the people. For the people shouted with a great shout. The sound was heard far away. Well, other cities would have heard the shout. Jerusalem is near the border of Judah, between Judah and Israel. And remember, this is all Persia, so it's more of a region of Persia now. It's not a nation, right? So the Jews are still waiting for God's promises. They're back in the land, but it's not their land. God hasn't really fulfilled his promise to Abraham yet, or to David, because there's no king on the throne. They have a governor, but not a king. Persia is still in control. So, meanwhile, in the territory that used to be Israel, it's the region now of Samaria, named after the capital city of Israel before it fell, and there were a lot of foreigners there. So, got to go way back in the story to when Assyria started spreading as an empire, a couple hundred years before this. So Assyria would take people out of their cities and put them in other cities, and take people from those cities and put them in different cities, and those cities and put them back in this city. So you had the people of Samaria, who were worshiping the Lord very incorrectly and were worshiping lots of other gods, were taken captive out of Samaria, out of Israel, and other people from other nations were put there. So you have all these people from these other nations now in Samaria worshiping their gods, and trying to learn to worship Yahweh as the God of this new land that they're living in. So they're worshiping the Lord, and they're worshiping their own gods. So they hear about all this commotion going on in Jerusalem, and they come to check it out and see what's going on, and they say, oh, you're rebuilding the temple to Yahweh. That's great. We too worship Yahweh. Let us help you. And the people of Judah say, absolutely not. Like, yeah, you say you worship Yahweh, but you're also worshiping all these other gods. And that's what got us into this mess in the first place. No, absolutely not. You have no part with us. You're not even really Jews. You're not from Israel. You're from all sorts of other places. And there were a few people, a few families who had returned, and they were really, their families, their ancestors were from Israel, but they were still worshiping all these other gods. And the people of Judah say, no, absolutely not. And that started some deep animosity. Now, the animosity already existed right from the time of the Civil War. Judah and Israel split during the Civil War, and they've always been at odds ever since then. But even more so now, when these people of Israel they say they're worshiping the Lord, but they're not doing it properly, and they're also worshiping lots of other gods at the same time. And the people of Judah say, no, no way, you're not helping us. You don't have any part in this project. You have no part with us. And that animosity got even stronger. Well, their enemies, largely the people from Samaria, from that region, they went back to the Persians and said, hey, those people down in Jerusalem, they're rebuilding their temple. And you should know, these are a rebellious people. They have a history of rebelling. After they finish the temple, they're going to start rebuilding the city, and they're going to put walls around the city. And as soon as those walls are up, they're going to rebel against you. And they're always they're trouble to everybody. You need to stop this right now. And the people of Persia, they say, we have a new king here named Darius. And so King Darius just kind of says, all right, just here's what I say. It's not an official decree, unchangeable decree, but temporarily tell them they must stop working on their temple. They must cease immediately until we can look into the matter. And he needed to find out what the original decree was exactly for them and do some other research. And a lot of the accusations were true. They did have a history of rebellion. They rebelled 3 times against Babylon. The third time that's what caused Jerusalem to be destroyed. They certainly are rebellious people. And their enemies here are probably right. So, Darius does a wise thing. He says, just tell them to stop completely what they're doing, and they can go back and rebuild their houses and do whatever they need to do, but no work on the temple, no work on walls around the city. Just they have to stop till we can look into it. And so word comes back, his like this court order issued. You have to stop what you're doing until further notice. So they stop, and they start working on their own houses. And they finish their houses. The houses are nice. They're building the businesses. The city starts to do okay. And as the businesses grow, they have more income. They start putting additions on their houses, nice swimming pool in the backyard, all these nice things. They get their BMWs and anything they want, big screen TVs inside. And 10 years go by, and the Lord sends 2 prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. And the main message of both of these prophets is the same. The Lord says to them, the time has come, get off your butts and start building the temple. Now, at first glance, this sounds a little odd because if you remember, when King David, wanted to build the temple of the Lord said, I've never asked for a temple. I don't need a temple. I have no interest. I'll let your son do it, but I have other work for you to do, David. Well, here, the Lord is saying, hey, what about me? What about my house? Build my house. Right? It almost sounds like God changed his mind and he became so fond of that house that he wants it built again. But really, it was about the hearts. When David first wanted to build the temple, God knew David's heart, and David was looking out from his palace window saying, look at all this beautiful stuff the Lord has given me. And the Lord is dwelling outside in a tent. This isn't right. The Lord's house should be far more big and beautiful than my house. And the Lord allowed him to at least prepare for the temple, and then allowed for his son to build it. Now, the people's hearts have really kind of lost sight of the Lord. It's just the Lord's not a priority for them. And they're so busy rebuilding their own lives that they've forgotten about the Lord. And the Lord is therefore saying, get your priorities straight here. My house is lying in ruins. It's still just a bunch of rubble you have a foundation and then rubble, nothing else. And, you're doing all this stuff for your own houses. Get your priorities straightened out. Start building the wall. Zechariah, in particular, his prophecy talks a lot more about stuff that would be considered the day of the Lord or the last day, end times. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, definitely check out Zechariah. But those two prophets send their messages, and the people do get back to work. And their enemies find out about it, try to stop them. And the people end up scrambling to build these things. They're pretty terrified, and they do have quite a bit of opposition. They finally get done, and the temple's built. They offer sacrifices to the Lord. They celebrate the Passover, really the first time in a while. They gathered priests, and one of the priests was Ezra, who the book of Ezra is named after him. So Ezra went to see everything that was happening. There are still a lot of problems going on, and Ezra the priest handles many of them. Among other things, there was a lack of priests. Some of the people were not really qualified to be priests. He had to weed through those. And then Ezra found out that many of the men of the city were marrying foreign women who worshipped foreign gods. And Ezra's saying, haven't you read the history books here? Don't you know our history? That's how we got sucked into this. We started intermingling with all these other people and started worshiping their gods, and look where we ended up. And now you're doing this all over again. We just got back here, and you're already doing this. And Ezra, the priest, he's so upset about this that he tears his clothes, he pulls hair out of his beard, and he just sits there grieving. He's appalled by what's happening. And finally, the time comes and he confronts the people, and they repent. They say, we're sorry, what we did was wrong. They start sending away their wives, divorcing their wives, and trying to make things right there. Well, some time goes by, and another guy, Nehemiah, he is the king's cupbearer. And when you're the king's cupbearer, you are risking your own life every time you eat something to potentially save the king's life. The king puts a lot of trust in you, and they got to know each other very well. They liked each other, so he had a very good relationship with the king. Well, Nehemiah heard that the city was still a disastrous mess. The people were rebuilding businesses and houses, and the temple was finally rebuilt. But the city in general was just, it was completely unprotected. The wall was torn down and was never rebuilt, and there's just so much work to do. Nehemiah knew that without that wall, they have so much opposition. At some point, they're going to be attacked by their enemies, and they'll be slaughtered. So Nehemiah is grieving. He gets permission from the king to go back and just figure out what needs to be done and help them. So Nehemiah gets back and wanders around just to see what actually has to happen, motivates the people, gathers this whole everybody becomes part of this construction team, and they start building the wall around the city. And their enemies are trying to stop them, both through legal action and just attacking them, to the point where the builders had a sword with them at all times. The Bible describes it as a sword in one hand and a hammer in the other hand, basically. And they're ready to fight at any moment. They had guards all over the place and, just watching out. And they are able to finish at least, the wall all the way around the city, not as high as it was, not as protective as it needed to be, but they had some protection now. They did this in record time, extremely quick, in spite of people trying to stop them. Well, at one point, the people of the city start complaining to Nehemiah, saying, "We can't do this anymore." Nehemiah says, "Why not?" It's like, well, we're neglecting our own farms. We're neglecting our own businesses. We have nothing. And the governors here, the leaders here of the city, are charging us such high, atrocious interest on loans just so that we can eat, that we can't even pay the loans back. We're selling our children into slavery so we can be here building the wall. Well, Nehemiah hears this and flips out. And he approaches these people who are ripping off their own people. What are you thinking? What are you doing? Right? Is it true you're charging this amount of interest on loans just so that they can get some food? And they said, well, it's like this. And Nehemiah just lays into them so hard that the people give them back their money. Say, okay, you don't owe me any interest. And he works that all out. And then Nehemiah, once the wall is built and everything is okay, they have some celebration, some feast. And then Nehemiah finds out that once again, the men of the city have taken foreign wives for themselves. Again, the second time. And Ezra, the priest, when this happened the first time, he tore his clothes, he pulled hair out of his beard in grief. Nehemiah is not a priest, and he takes a different approach. He tears their clothes and tears hair out of their beards, and he starts beating them. I kind of like his approach. But once again, the people repent, and they promise to divorce their foreign wives and whatever they have to do. And now, I'm not clear what God thinks of the people deciding to divorce their foreign wives at this point. They shouldn't have married them to begin with, but I'm not clear that was really what God wanted. Maybe not. Well, in the next session, we'll look at the book of Esther. Esther is not rated PG, so brace yourselves. But we'll get a glimpse not only of that storyline, but get a sense of what was happening with the people who did not return to Jerusalem, but had stayed behind and lived around the leaders of the Persian Empire.